Wow, what a great way to start. Good afternoon, everybody, and really a warm welcome to all of you to the second in our webinar series titled Troubling Psychology in Troubled Times. And this particular webinar, of course, is jointly hosted by the Psychological Society of South Africa and the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences. For those of you who don't know, my name is Garth Stevens. I'm the current president of the Psychological Society of South Africa, and I will be the moderator for this great panel that we have put together for today. Let me start by saying good afternoon to all of you who are in our time zone. Good evening to those of you in the Eastern Hemisphere, and good morning to those of you in the Western Hemisphere. It's wonderful to have a truly international panel today and an audience on this particular topic. I think the number of people joining us, I see the numbers growing all the time, but I think we had something like over 700 people register for this particular webinar today. So great to see you all. The song that we've just listened to is really fitting for today. It is a song that comes off a 1976 album called Colonial Man, and it's titled Vasco da Gama by the incomparable jazz musician Hugh Masekela, who hails from South Africa. And of course, Masekela was really offering a counterfactual to the narrative of exploration and discovery that so many of us were taught at our schools, but was referencing for what it was and what it is. That actually these were moments of colonization and of course, coloniality. And this is very much speaking to the title of the webinar today, which is Decolonial Praxis in Contemporary Global Community Psychologies. Our speakers have really all worked in this area extensively, continue to work in this area. And of course, many of the speakers, or all of the speakers, have contributed to an upcoming book that's titled Decoloniality and Epistemic Justice in Contemporary Community Psychology. The series editors for this particular book series is Professor Mohammed Sidat and Professor Shanaz Safla, and the book is co-edited by Christopher Sonn, who's one of our speakers, and myself. And of course, everybody on the panel today has written something or other in the book. And so I really encourage you all to have a good read when it does come out in the next couple of weeks. Just one or two housekeeping matters from our side. Of course, we would, under normal circumstances, have held a Congress each year. But this year and last year, because of COVID-19, we've had to do things differently. And so we've offered different formats of events to cater for diverse needs, to really speak to multiple audiences and publics. And some of these have been the PsySSA workshops, and many of you would have seen these workshops being flighted already. They will continue to the end of the year. But this particular webinar series is really a webinar series that is hosted by the PsySSA presidency. There are four webinars in the series this year, some of them hosted with partners. They are free, they are open to all, they're CPD accredited. You get 2 general CPD points for these. And of course, the 2021 series theme from the presidency is Troubling Psychology in Troubling Times, really amplifying and contributing to one of the foci at the cutting edge of psychology at the moment. And that is how it is that we continue to think about psychology and its utility and its relevance in these troubled times. The PsySSA webinar series will, of course, conclude with an annual President's Lecture, which we've introduced this year. And the annual President's Lecture is really in memory of past PsySSA presidents who've passed on. And we've wanted to recognize and honor their contributions to society, the discipline, the profession. And here I'm talking about colleagues who've left us like Siphiwe Ngobe, Patrick Sibaya, Rachel Prinsloo, and of course, Lionel Nicholas. We're also wanting to think about the President's Lecture as really something that pulls together the webinar series at the end. And so we hope that you will join us for that later in the year. Some housekeeping matters from the PsySSA office. And that's really that delegates are asked to complete the CPD evaluations, and the evaluation form will be shared in the chat in the last 15 or 20 minutes of the session, just so that you're able to receive a CPD certificate. The information on the webinars and workshop series will also be shared during the course of the webinar. And of course, the webinar recording will be made available on the PsySSA YouTube channel in due course. But back to the webinar today. I think it's, again, the webinar today is really talking about decolonial praxis in contemporary global community psychologies. And as I've indicated, this is part of a 3-book series edited by Mohammed Sidat and Shanaz Safla. I think that given that we're going to be talking about this, it's probably quite important to speak briefly to the idea of the decolonial turn that I think has gained traction across many, many social movements, political formations. It's gained traction in the academy, and so many academic disciplines are turning towards decoloniality as an orientation. And of course, psychology has not been left out of the loop. There have been a number of special issues and books recently speaking specifically to decoloniality in psychology. And so I really encourage you all to have a look at these and really to follow some of the debates and the discussions that have been going on in psychology at present. But of course, decoloniality as a concept has also had its detractors. And often the critique is leveled that it is a signifier that is empty in some ways, that it means everything to everyone. But this, of course, can happen to all discourses. And our aim today is really to offer some insights into forms of praxis that embody this idea of decoloniality, that gives substance to it in the everyday. And really, we're wanting to look at this in the work that our panelists do, and really also to listen to some of their thinking. I think it's also important as we think about decoloniality as in some ways paradigmatic. It is an orientation that suggests that coloniality extends beyond colonization and its own end as a political process, impacting on relations of power, ways of being, subjectivities, modes of knowledge. And in this way, I think that it's important that we say that coloniality is not simply a residue or a legacy of colonization, but is a set of continuities into the present that finds expression in modern systems. And these systems include the kind of geopolitical systems that we think about, modes of capital accumulation, cultural decimation and hegemony, systems of race, class, gender, knowledge, and so forth. So of course, these continuities emerge from the rise of Western modernity and what some have referred to as the darker side of Western modernity, and that being colonization and coloniality. So what would a decolonial praxis entail if it is required to be attentive to these ongoing continuities? And our speakers today will share some of their thoughts and work on the topic from their particular perspectives. We will, as you noted from the screen, there is a Q&A box, and we encourage you to type your questions into that Q&A box. We will have a section at the end of the webinar for questions and answers where you can engage the speakers, and we'll have a moderated moment to do that. Without further ado, and wanting to get into the meat of the webinar today, I'm going to do some brief introductions of our 5 speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them as they will be speaking. I will introduce all of them at this point so that they can simply flow after each other and I won't interrupt them. And essentially, they'll be asked to speak for 10 to 12 minutes on particular areas that they've worked in, on their thoughts on decoloniality, psychology, community psychology, and so forth. So our first speaker is Professor Christopher Sonn, and Chris has a PhD and is a professor at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia, where he lives and works. He's a fellow of the Institute of Health and Sport and Deputy Director, Research and Research Training. His research is concerned with understanding and changing dynamics of oppression, examining structural violence such as racism and its effects on social identities, intergroup relations, and belonging. The next person to speak will be Professor Urmitapa, who is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and her activist research program uses decolonial and transnational feminist scholarship to understand and disrupt everyday violence, that is, forms of direct, structural, and symbolic violence that are normalized and become endemic to the social fabric. She uses critical qualitative methodologies to denaturalize oppressive conditions and to articulate experiences that are silenced by officially sanctioned narratives. Our third speaker today is Professor Alison Baker, who is an associate professor in youth and community studies in the College of Arts and Education at Victoria University in Melbourne. Her research focuses on the implications of structures that produce inequality in the lives of various disenfranchised groups, as well as those in positions of privilege. Her research also focuses on young people's experiences of racialization and other forms of oppression, particularly their subjectivities, identity, and belonging across contexts. Our fourth speaker is Professor Puleng Segalo, who is a professor of social and community psychology, currently holding the position of the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair at the University of South Africa. She holds master's and doctoral degrees in psychology from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and she also holds a doctoral certificate in women's studies from the same university. Her areas of specialization include community psychology, social psychology, and gender and feminism in psychology. And our last speaker is Professor Nelson Maldonado-Torres, who is a professor in the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies, chair of the Comparative Literature Program, faculty affiliate in the graduate program in Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and director of the Advanced Institute for Critical Caribbean Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. He's also Professor Extraordinaris at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at the University of South Africa, Honorary Professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and co-chair of the Frans Fanon Foundation with its founder, Mireille Fanon Mendes France. He also works in a program on Black consciousness and decoloniality with a Black House collective in South Africa. So, colleagues, I'm sure that you can see that we have an illustrious group of people with us today. It's really wonderful to be able to have you across these different time zones. I know that this is a big ask for those of you getting up early in the morning and those of you staying up late at night, but wonderful to have you all with us. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Chris as our first speaker. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Garth, and thank you also to PsySSA, the Institute of Social and Health Sciences, for hosting this event. I'm very grateful to be here in the virtual world and to share this moment with friends and colleagues. It's always wonderful for me to return home, even if via this virtual webinar. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land where I live and work. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the knowledge, traditions, and practices that have sustained communities for centuries. Garth has laid out some of the background for this book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes that we've distilled, just to orient us towards decolonial practice or practices towards decoloniality. This book, as Garth has noted, is one of 3 in the Springer Community Psychology book series. He's also mentioned that decoloniality is as old as colonialism. It's been expressed in different ways across the world. While many disciplines have seemingly had longer engagement with decolonization and decoloniality, various areas of psychology, and in particular, community and community-oriented psychologies, have a more recent explicit engagement with this term. Community psychology is, of course, a diverse field, a professional practice category in some contexts, and for many an orientation to psychological research and practice. Around the world, CP has varied expressions, but often hold in common a set of principles and values pointed towards research and practice that can help create settings and through critical inquiry transform oppressive realities in the pursuit of liberation and well-being. But we also need to be aware, as noted by Ratele, Garth, Capano, and some other colleagues, Nick Malherbe, that community psychology itself is an internally variegated, contested, and sometimes combative space, at times more aligned with mainstream psychology, and at other times being more critical of, and to varying degrees, rupturing with mainstream psychology. In this book that Garth had mentioned, various authors lay out what decolonization and decoloniality means in their context, and how they are crafting modes of praxis in the pursuit of epistemic justice, which is a key feature of the decolonial effort. Epistemic justice is understood as the ways in which privileged knowledge structures and practices disempower, devalue, and harm people and communities, as proposed by Shotwell. The collective epistemic resources on which we depend to make sense of and engage the world may be both impoverished and harmed by systemic oppression. The book emerges from efforts to foster transnational solidarities, propelled by a sense of urgency to create ways of knowing, doing, and being that disrupts coloniality of power, both within and outside our discipline, profession, academia, and in everyday contexts. And drawing on Ratelli and colleagues again, we note that these efforts, the claiming a space, must be a deliberate and conscious political act. Knowledge is not an objective artifact that is simply to be uncovered or discovered. It's always reproduced and imbued with power. So I'm going to talk a little bit about three of the sorts of interrelated practices towards epistemic justice that we summarize through this book. These are archival expansion and retrieval, knowledges from the margins or from below, and critical and mutual accompaniment in place. So for the first, one of the practices towards epistemic justice can be broadly understood as the recovery of historical memory. For Sufla, Shanaz, and Muhammad Sidat argue that the retrieval of African knowledge archives and of ways of knowing and being that have been subalternized is a necessary intervention into the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Archival retrieval, according to them, entails a process of onto epistemic disruption, a sort of de-idealization, the retrieval and revelation of multiple knowledge archives, and as they say, that have been neglected or made appendage to the Western-centric ontological and epistemological frames that continue to shape the underlying assumptions of community psychology in many countries, is necessary to create inclusive decolonial psychologies. In the book, various authors engage in archival retrieval and reclamation. One example is the elevation of Black consciousness as articulated by Steve Biko. And quoting Sufla and Sidat, Biko's culturally constitutive ontology, an element of which we conceptualize here as collectivist and humanizing ontology, seeks to break from the colonial conception of being and challenge its associated erasures and negations of Black personhood. Our theorizations thus strive to transcend the extrusions of the colonial archive, an imperative that remains exigent in the context of coloniality of knowledge, power, and being. Others in the book also highlight the deep collectivist humanist values in Africanist ways of being that they seek to center in producing decolonizing community psychology pedagogy. And I think Puleng will maybe speak about that a little later. Other examples of archival retrieval and expansion includes the articulation of knowledges born in the borderlands between research and social movements. Fine notes that the activists, scholars, and texts have suffered death by cannon, whited out from the imperial positivist universal law-seeking, power-flattening history of psychology through acts of epistemicide. The ways of being, doing, and knowing of First Nations and Indigenous communities have also led calls for decolonization and repowering. Mohirua, a colleague in New Zealand, and his colleagues demonstrate cultural responsive community research and action based in Puapapa Maori knowledge that is central to healing and cultural restoration. Importantly, this onto epistemic disruption provides new visions rooted in neglected archives for decolonizing the matrix of power and providing sources for healing, sense of community and liberation. Archival retrieval and creation is a political act. A second sort of practice is the centering knowledges from below and centering voices of subjects. Across all of the chapters, there's a focus on centering the knowledge from below, the periphery. In some ways, this is resonant of Martin Barrot's preferential option for the poor. The poor in some cases are those relegated to the zone of non-being, those who are made nobodies, who are nobody in various contexts by systems of oppression, including epistemic violence. The experiences of majority world, those who are far removed from the centers of power, provide a perspective advantage rooted in lived experiences about intersecting systems of domination. For example, Urmi, who's on this panel, in her work uses the everyday as an analytical category to show the gaps between official discourse and the lived realities of youth and women in northern India. She shows how ruptures at these gaps can lead to the denaturalization of ethnic violence and epistemic decolonization. Others, like Dolores Guerbolini, who lives and works in Puerto Rico, uses Anzalduan notion of Nepantla to name their decolonial journey in Puerto Rico. She says that those of us who have lived the colonization know what it means to move between borders of oppressed and oppressor. This is not unique to our experience. As historical subjects, we are decentered, moving in different directions, transiting diverse subjectivations. In my context in Australia, there's growing engagement with Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being in various spheres, including towards climate justice, healing, and retrieving cultural practices rooted in Indigenous notions of country and land to inform healing and decolonization. A colleague, Paula Bella, have elevated the voices of Aboriginal women activists who are speaking back and black, and an indigenized version of the term black, B-L-A-K, through cultural practice. Through practice-led inquiry and the creation of exhibitions, Paula has mobilized the storytelling on country to create settings for healing yarns and Indigenous methodology, along with exhibitions for counter-narration as an enactment of self-determination and disruption of what Rappaport calls the tales of terror, or what Fatak and Fine is referred to as damage-centered narratives. A third practice we referred to and we organized around the notion of critical mutual accompaniment, intersectional identities, and dialogical ethics. It is clear in much of the writing on the decolonial turn that an ontology and epistemology of relatedness drives this agenda. Nelson, who is on this panel, noted that building the world of the you entails an opposition to metaphysical catastrophe, the paradigm of war and ontological separation. In many of the work that we've gathered in this volume, people have articulated epistemologies, methodologies that center participation, relationships, and reciprocity. The chapters speak to a praxis from below in the borderlands. The questions what, with whom, on whose terms, with whose ways of doing are central for epistemological reflexivity, aimed at reshaping power relations in research practice and the everyday. The upside down approaches, such as community-engaged research, community-based participatory action research, that are open to interdisciplinarity and that embrace popular knowledges are evident in many of the chapters. Martin Barrault called for responsive and accountable psychology practices in his notion of accompaniment, and to quote him, "The choice is being accompanying or not accompanying the oppressed majorities. This is not a question of whether to abandon psychology. It is a question of whether psychological knowledge will be placed in the service of constructing a society where the welfare of the few is not built on the wretchedness of the many, where the fulfillment of some does not require that others be deprived, where the interests of the minority do not demand the dehumanization of all." Watkins commented that accompaniment as an approach requires fundamental reorientation for those who have been born into or educated into white economic or social privilege. The vantage point brings into focus privilege, power, and subject positions or intersectional identities, and the dynamics of crafting contingent, co-intentional alliances together in place. The alliances in place are ways to journey through space and time in relations of affective conviviality, as noted by Nuria Chiofalo. So these three interrelated sorts of orientations crystallizes to some extent some of what is evident in the book. And moving forward through transnational solidarities, as I look forward, the book is part of local and transnational efforts to expand our ecologies of knowledge and to decolonize community psychologies in varied and various contexts. The many conversations and actions in place. We have a group at Victoria University and with colleagues have been crafting a space for critical community psychology scholarship in the neoliberalizing university. We are connecting with others in the so-called global north, global south, and together retrieving, revising, extending existing archives. We are also building new living archives, capitalizing on this digital moment. We want to and need to foster and sustain solidarities in these contentious and unsettling times. We are doing so in many ways, including through the creation of a living archive that started with the International Community Psychology Conference series that's been going since 2006. Again, the first of it was held in Puerto Rico in that year. We also have a number of journals, and Garth have already mentioned the growing connections on how people are coming together to produce knowledge that tells alternative, different, and counter stories. And then we're also thinking about how to mobilize and how to sustain transnational networks. And we have a project, another project called Moving Critical Voices to the Forefront, building global solidarities with community scholars to increase scholarly impact and inform everyday practice. So we invite you to join with us, pluralizing psychology and expanding our ecologies of knowledge and practice to contribute to decolonial futures as a productive, generative, and collective task. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm going to invite Urmi to perhaps share some of her thoughts at this point.
Thank you so much, Garth and Chris, for introducing this panel. It is an honor to be here today and sharing space with so many amazing scholar activists from across the globe. As Garth introduced my work, my scholar activism focuses on understanding and disrupting everyday violence that is normalized, direct, and structural violence configured by intersecting vectors of coloniality, heteropatriarchy, and racial capitalism. Specifically, I interrogate linkages between epistemic violence and myriad forms of domination. I work in solidarity with communities excluded from dominant knowledge structures. Together, we theorize from below as a form of epistemic justice. So today I will briefly speak to theorizing from below as a decolonial imperative. The work of theorizing from below always takes place from rooted spaces. So for me, this work takes place from my relational, affective, historical, and geospatial rootedness in the northeastern borders of the Indian state. Recognizing, of course, that the very idea of India is an inherently violent one for many. For Kashmiris who have been the targets of settler colonial and military occupation by India for many years now. For many indigenous and tribal communities whose right to self-determination is annihilated by the hegemonic idea of India. Or Dalit people who are dehumanized and are denied a place in the national imaginary, particularly in light of rising Hindu fascism and white adjacent Brahminical supremacy. So speaking from these rooted places means that I have to always and actively work against the state and colonially configured borders. Coloniality has severed the multiplicity of relationships between people and place in South Asia, particularly in Northeast India. So much so that even indigeneity is adjudicated using colonial and statist markers. And I talk about this more in the chapter, in the volume that Chris and Garth talked about. So some of this is evident in the tribulations of young people in Garo Hills as they navigate the fraught experience of belonging. The reliance on colonially configured categories and classifications reinforced by the post-colonial state relegates them to perpetual alterity. This is also evident in my current work alongside Mia people in Northeast India. Mia people are descendants of Muslim peasants displaced from British-occupied Bengal to present Northeast India for agricultural labor, one of the many instances of colonial population transfers or forced migration. Labeled as illegal migrants or foreigners, Mia communities have borne legacies of past persecution. The most recent iteration of this has taken the form of mass disenfranchisement, detention, and statelessness, what Mia poet Shalim Hussain calls, quote, trapped by the border. There is a willful forgetting of contingencies of violent partitions and arbitrary borders that establish tiered categories, not just of one's right to belong, but of one's very right to exist. Working towards epistemic justice from these embodied and relationally rooted places entails stripping away layers of incomprehensibility and unintelligibility, of borders and partitions, of categories and classifications, all textures of violence that are obfuscated by broad sweeping terms such as ethnic conflict, militancy, and at times even peace. Working from a place of rootedness in Northeast India means that gaps or ruptures rather than continuity constitute the normative context of our work. Whether it is the gap between our intimately experienced everyday lives and mainstream academic and public discourse, or the gap between our affective experiences and political legal arrangements, or the rupture that relegates us to zones of unintelligibility in relation to the global north, as well as the hegemony of post-colonial studies that have privileged access to creating knowledges about South Asia. Knowledges that silence, flatten, and erase our textured experiences, that see us as impossibly local and non-compliant theoretical subjects. Therefore, theorizing from below is a critical decolonial imperative for us. We attend to lived experiences, listen to stories at these rupturing or interstitial spaces. These are sites of creative practice from where we can speak truth to power, always in defense of justice and against that which is dehumanizing. Storytelling occupies a central place in Mia people's resistance. In fact, storytelling and listening are vital to how we theorize together. Here, listening is an engaged, embodied, and deeply affective process. We approach the task of listening from a relational and ethical orientation that is geared towards elevating those who have been silenced by colonial state-sponsored and epistemic violence. The process of listening liberates, makes, and remakes stories. Some stories are ripe, fully formed, and years in the making, just waiting to be told. Others are instigated as an idea or feeling that transform into powerful narratives in shared retellings. Yet other stories emerge from contradictions, fomenting and percolating, still taking form. We look to oral histories and Mia resistance poetry to complicate relationships between people and place, to explore alternatives to hegemonic accounts that erase Mia communities' relationships to land and water. These modes of storytelling refuse the seeming intractability of binaries contingent on invidious categories of race and ethnicity. For example, migrant or outsider versus indigenous or authentic. Instead, they uplift affective histories, messy attachments, and everyday practices. Through such retelling and rewriting of place, they establish radically inclusive modes of belonging, where belonging is an affect and an ethic rather than a secure ontological entity rooted in notions of authentic or original inhabitant, the kinds of framings that underlie much of what gets labeled as ethnic conflict in Northeast India. Such restoration of stories of historical and contemporary realities are powerful enactments of epistemic justice. The collective process of constructing stories is as important as the stories that are co-created. In our work, we understand collective as akin to what Maria Lugones calls communality, that is, ways of being, knowing, and relating that are predicated on resisting oppressions and envisioning futures together. Communality is both the starting point and the method for crafting and reclaiming stories in our endeavors to build an archive or repository of knowledge, an archive that not only confronts historical and ongoing oppression, but also upholds Mia people's desire, honoring rage, grief, pain, creativity, and love. In the process, stories become critical sites and modes of theory and knowledge construction. As Mia people's struggles teach us, we must actively resist damage-centered narratives of third world or global South people and elevate textured stories that are irreducible in their complexity. We must refuse normalized practices of theorizing about on the backs of those suffering without committing to the fullness of their lives. Therefore, a decolonial turn in community psychology is not about creating a disciplinary subfield. Rather, I see it as a call to action, to create, nurture, and sustain ways of being, relating, and knowing beyond oppressive colonial modalities. We must do this work from a deeply rooted place of care, responsibility, and ethics that emanate from being in struggle or in solidarity with those at the front lines of struggle. In fact, we must remember that decolonial impulses have long been part of many people's movements for collective self-determination. As I end, I want to leave you with the words and wisdom of Mia community workers, Manjuara, Abdul Kalam, Kazinil, and Wahida, by sharing some translated excerpts from an open letter that they wrote to social science researchers who seek to write about them. And I share these because I think these are extremely relevant to the conversation that we are having today. I begin. If you want to get together with us, with our people, with community workers, it cannot be project-based. It must not be the kind of work that ends with the funding cycle. For us, there are no deadlines or endpoints. This is our life's work. Our people are some of the most persecuted communities of our time. The state and many factions of civil society are aggressive in their agenda to dehumanize us, harass us, disenfranchise us, and incarcerate us. To collaborate with us, you must be prepared to work with people in active struggle. This work will yield little material benefit, and you must be prepared to be courageous and share the risks. Researchers often come from different worlds, fortified by their professional tools and theoretical vocabulary. They use these tools to begin what we are going through, to explain what we are going through. When people come to do research, the assumption is that we do not have the language or vocabulary to articulate our experiences, that someone else needs to tell our stories. They impose their own jargon and sophisticated vocabulary on our experiences and how we understand it. We do not need our experiences to be rendered intelligible through your armature of definitions, scales, and criteria, or via metaphors that are not our own. We too can speak. We are good enough. As researchers, honor our vocabulary, our metaphors, and our silences. If you do tell our stories, tell those with human dignity. Tell our stories as an act of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Urmi. That was really, really powerful. And thanks for your insights around your work. I'm going to call on Alison at this point. And Alison, if you could just share your thoughts with us. Thanks.
Thanks, Garth. And I just want to reiterate what everyone else has said about just appreciating the space that you've created for us to share our stories and work today. I also want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Boimarong, Woiwurrung, and the Wutherong of the Kulin Nation here, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. Just will share my screen. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking with New Change today, and that this is part of the chapter that Chris Sonn and Roma Gongagosti have, that we've all written together. Are you all able to see my screen? Sorry.
Hi, Alison. We sing partially. It's not a full screen.
Let's see. Is that all right?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Achol tidbat miakon tidbat miakon kir. Plant the change for future generations. Child of blessing, never replaceable. I am Achol. I remember the first time I found my voice. I thought to myself, I was thinking, will I ever be heard? Will it be loud? But I knew my silence would not last forever. And I finally spoke. blessing, joyful happiness. Adao, Ater, Nur, Dio, carried in love, born in light, wanted and cherished in the spirit and mind. Stitching together the past and the future, I am Adele. I have found my voice, weaver of futures and hope. There is power where my ancestors' dreams are spoken. Loyal, carefree child.
I just wanted to start this talk today with a sound portrait of the voices of young women from New Change, an arts collective. The 8 group members are of African heritage, primarily South Sudanese, who have been using an arts for social change framework to empower, motivate, and educate others. As part of their activist work, New Change would open their community arts performances, exhibitions, and talks in schools and community with their name poems. In complete silence, they would stand at the front with tape over their mouths, a symbol of the silencing they experience in Australian society. Next, they would rip the tape off and each member would step forward and recite her name poem. Sorry. As we know, names have meaning. They're culturally significant. They tell the story of who you are, who came before you, and even where you're going. In South Sudanese culture, you're often named in relation to other family members, the circumstance of your birth, like being born during a conflict or after the loss of another child. Like so many migrants, when young women came to Australia as children on humanitarian grounds, their names were mispronounced, made fun of, inside schools and on playgrounds and in everyday interactions. Their names became markers of non-belonging. And that's just one of the many ways in which the legacy of white supremacy plays out through symbolic violence in our context. Race, racialization, and whiteness have been central to the creation of Australia as a settler nation. Prominent Indigenous scholar Morton Robinson identifies white possession of Australia as being central to defining the boundaries of and belonging connected to nationhood. Today, young people of African heritage face systemic and structural forms of racism that become slow violence, that operate out of sight, over time, and across settings. They threaten life chances and erode aspirations. Public discourses are at the center of racialized violence, with politicians, the media, and others generating dominant narratives about African young people that, as Wendell notes, elicit a map of stereotypes and depict a culture of violence. This ensures that the denial of colonial legacies and neo-colonial relations that implicate countries such as Australia in a broader system of global relations that were built and are sustained on white supremacy. They're examples of coloniality of power as it's expressed in everyday contexts here. Young African Australian women have been rendered invisible in public discourses, in academic literature. As De Sousa Santos notes, we must pay attention to these silences, how they are created, and how particular knowledges and ways of being are made invisible. The white echo chamber of racist, dominant cultural narratives combined with age gender hierarchies in their own communities are forces that turn many voices to whispers. As we outline and illustrate in the 2 case studies in our chapter promoting epistemic justice, community arts organizations and participatory research collectives have been spaces for young people to create connection, communality, shared experiences, and places to craft stories that convey the violence of racism rooted in colonialism. They also become important spaces for healing. My story with New Change began when I heard they were starting their journey using arts for social change to tackle media misrepresentation of young people of African background. As a researcher exploring community arts and the links to belonging, identity, and activism through sound, I was interested in documenting their group and their creation of the spoken word film clip, Breaking News. In this clip, the group combined collective poetry, laced with symbolism and cultural meanings, traditional dance, song, and performance to weave together a counter story about the South Sudanese community and to awaken the public to the issue of racism that they face. As an outsider in a number of ways, I was welcomed and questioned. Did I have their backs? What was my role? Grappling with these questions and challenges, whilst also witnessing the young women develop their activist voices, prompted reflections that shaped me and my role in the group and beyond. Rather than just being a researcher documenting their work, I became part of the group in arts workshops, where we wrote and shared poetry that dug deeply into our lives. For me and many group members, it became a shared context for witnessing, airing grievances across power lines of race and gender, but also nourishing identities, building solidarities, and intensifying voices for social change. 5 months into the research, in the wake of breaking news, New Change decided they wanted to shift from being a local council-run program to an independent youth-led collective, with the support of myself and a local social worker. This was mainly because they'd been censored by council for referring to the white man in their video. As one member reflects, we couldn't speak our truth full on. Some words had to be edited because they were targeting the white community. Over this year-long period, we sought to work as a group through a horizontal mode of leadership to move towards youth ownership by co-running weekly sessions, organizing public speaking opportunities, and advocacy development. We delivered workshops and public talks in schools and in community settings. Across the multiple roles that I've taken up within the group, facilitator, friend, or researcher, I'm constantly working through the web of power, the structures of whiteness, and the politics of representation that arise in the contact zone in and out of community and research spaces. The balancing act was felt by many New Change members between educating the public and ensuring that they wouldn't be cornered into the single story. One New Change member said they don't want to get to know young people. They don't want to know about their real lives. They would ask me, what about your hobbies? Oh, I like dancing. I like drawing. This is, and they would say, oh, you like dancing? Oh, do you express yourself through emotion? And when you're emotional, is it because of all the racism that's going on? Is it because of how you came to Australia? Everything would be tied back to racism, arriving to Australia, school, but just all negative. You'd have to advocate, 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 speak the truth they don't care about. You're trying hard to let them know we're good. Heighton asks the important question, what about voices that cry out to be heard, but those voices fall on deaf ears? Even if stories are doing the work, they're being refused. New Change members became tired of speaking back to whiteness, the persistent othering with little room to expand and project their voices and complex personhoods. Our collective became a site to digest the backlash and the rigidity of coloniality, how it infected our lives, albeit in very different ways. But it was also a place for each of us to listen to our own and others' voices, to see how we'd changed as activists and leaders, and to again, use these newfound skills and creative methods to read and speak back to the world. The group created a number of short films like Understand Me after this, and the stories that all spoke to the concerns that they had and felt that were affecting their own communities. In particular, a lack of intergenerational dialogue and mental health issues among young people. These are moves of epistemic disobedience. In coming back full circle, you can so clearly see now why New Change members' name poems were a decolonial action, an aesthetic or poetic interruption to rupture and resist, but also to center their knowledge, their cultural histories and traditions, to claim a space. I've been continuing to work to try to rupture and refuse coloniality while recognizing historical inheritance of privilege alongside young people from a range of cultural backgrounds. Central to navigating the entanglements of race, privilege, and other dynamics of oppression, and engaging in critical psychosocial praxis, are collective spaces in the academy and the community in which we can grapple with and remain vigilant to the turns, crossing, and walking of lines in and out of silence across boundaries and worlds that speak to the complexity of intersubjective spaces and the ongoing struggle to carve out ways of being together.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks for sharing those great insights from the work that you're doing. I'm going to ask Puleng at this point to come in. Thanks, Puleng.
Thank you, Garth. And good afternoon, everyone. I would also just like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. And I come to you today with multiple voices. I'm going to offer reflections based on the work that we conducted collectively with colleagues of mine, Hugo Kenham and Lisiba Baloyi. And what we were looking at was to disrupt the canon. And so what we do in our work is that we start by locating ourselves as decolonial dreamers. We do this by providing personal experiential accounts that inform our standpoints in relation to our attempts to disrupt through foregrounding African narratives and classroom practices. So we come from 3 different institutions, and we come together to engage and speak about the challenges and the possibilities that we see within the various academic institutions that we all form part of. So I speak with these multiple voices, and we do this as a way to challenge the canon. Canons or canonical thought represent well-trod ideas around which there is some consensus in relation to legibility, representation, validity, ontological truth claims, and ways of knowing these truths. This is to say that there are canonical methodologies and interpretations that are backed by institutionalization, scholarly and published work, the acceptance of a single standard, and a transhistorical universalistic value of what constitutes the exemplary. We challenge this canonical thought by highlighting how knowledge is embodied, how it's located in history, and also embedded within our communities. Our work demonstrates how we bring our bodies, our histories, and our communities to the pedagogical encounter. To this end, we align ourselves with decolonial scholars such as Ramon Grossfogel, who asserts that our job in the Westernized university is basically reduced to that of learning theories born from the experience and problems of a particular region of the world, with its own particular time and space dimensions, and then applying these to other geographical locations, even if the experience and time space of the former are quite different from the latter. And what Grossfogel does, and his words are that he echoes a social psychology scholar, Serge Moscovici, who a long time ago already in 1972 also reflected on the problematics of a universalistic psychology, where he says the real advance made by American social psychology was not so much in its empirical methods or in its theory construction as in the fact that it took for its theme of research and for the contents of its theories, the issues of its own society. Its merit was as much in its techniques as in translating the problems of American society into psychological terms and in making them an object of scientific inquiry. And so I'm sure we can understand, therefore, the problem of importing theories that were created, experimented on, and theorized based on a different context, and assuming that one can then just import that knowledge and assume it to be relevant and applicable in different contexts without really interrogating those theories first. So our contribution to decolonial community psychology is to highlight the ways in which context matters. This is a point also highlighted by scholars such as Frantz Fanon and also Chabane Manganyi. Fanon pointed to how the Black man or a Black person's psyche was constituted by the colonial situation. And similarly, Chabane Manganyi argued that the oppressive conditions of apartheid that Black people lived under had created a personality that reflected these conditions. And as we think about the social ills and injustices and inequities within our societies, it's therefore important for us to understand these from their historical perspective, and also that colonialism played a critical role in how we are experiencing our current conditions today. For both these African theories, it was clear that context and culture mattered for understanding the human subject. Manganyi and Fanon read against the grain of the canon by centering the location of their theorization. The question of what constitutes truth, reality, or what is known cannot therefore be understood from a universalist point of view. We argue, therefore, that a decolonial Afrocentric paradigm is necessary. In spite of the Euro-American subjugation of Africans and dominance over indigenous knowledges, African knowledge systems survived and developed over time. The use of African materials, labor, and data on the continent and elsewhere were central in the production of knowledge and the Western canon itself. So the intervention that we offer here is that Africa features and is co-constitutive of world knowledges. What is at stake is that the position of Africans as objects in relation to these knowledges, rather than as producers of authentic knowledge. The decolonial project is therefore one of reclamation, of reassessing what constitutes knowledge, and retraining the gaze, as Mignolo would say. This project is also about mounting a critique of the ways in which the Western gaze makes objects of those on its margins, whilst also creating something new. So finding ways to center those who have been put on the margins is part of the project of decolonization. For us, part of the decolonial impulse is to give texture to how community psychology advances local lives embedded in African cosmology. Here, we contend that South African community psychology should be more closely aligned with proponents of African psychology. Recognizing the nuanced differences between decoloniality, decolonization, and Africanization, we advocate for the recovery and centering of African epistemology in ways that draw on the conceptual basis of all these three perspectives.
Have you given Tabitha's email?
Sorry about that, Puleng. Fatima, can you please put your mic off?
Okay, thank you. So briefly stated, we follow Tucker and Yang, who contend that decolonization is not a metaphor for cosmetic change, but rather an act to return indigenous land and life. We view decoloniality as a related concept that is concerned with power in the creation of what Welch calls radically distinct social imaginaries, conditions, and relations of power and knowledge. And to Africanize is to therefore bring these together, is to give African content and form to decoloniality and decolonization. African land, life, and knowledges are therefore centered in a decolonized African university. There are multiple epistemological paradigms in the knowledge basket, and these realities should be reflective in psychology as a meaning-making social inquiry enterprise. Despite the calls that we've had for curriculum transformation, Western thought still dominates the academic philosophical landscape. One needs to just open many of our undergraduate prescribed textbooks to be able to see this. The colonial epistemologies that have introduced and sustained colonial thinking, culture, and language in our academy must be challenged to create an African epistemology and psychology which will be representative and reflective of the diverse African voices in meaning, in content, in scope, and also the structure of the psychology curriculum in general, and the teaching of community psychology in particular. Our insistence on the significance and meaningfulness of an African psychology community-based knowledge production is both necessary and imperative in creating the context for questioning the universality and applicability of Western educational epistemologies, methodologies, and pedagogy in pursuit of epistemic and social justice in Africa. The African psychology curriculum that we propose should be for and by African people, using theories, methods, sources, and techniques that are reflective of the African worldview. The current psychology curriculum is based on the conquerors' philosophies, their theories and methodologies, which continue to privilege Western ways of knowing while denying the validity of indigenous knowledge, culture, and also our own languages as well. So what would a decolonial African-centered community psychology look like? We argue that the concept of community and subsequently community psychology in Africa should be anchored on the African philosophical paradigm of Ubuntu. According to Mogobe Ramose, the epistemology of Ubuntu presupposes the existence of Umuntu, and that is the human being. Since Ubuntu demands of Abantu, Batu, or people to relate in a respectful, humane manner, Abantu, human beings, are ontologically oriented towards the betterment of human relations and the good of humanity in the context of community. The foundation of community building is peaceful interpersonal relationships. That's all that we want. So how do we get there? Relationships are indispensable in the formation, sustainability, and well-being of community. The Africanness of African people finds expression through the epistemology of Ubuntu. The glaring exclusion of Ubuntu in many community psychology prescribed textbooks and our training programs constitutes what Boaventura de Santos calls epistemicide. Because for Africans, Ubuntu is an ethic of being human. Ontologically, therefore, the African conception of being human is communal in nature, and personhood is reflected in people's relationships with others and their cultural context. On this reasoning, the inception of any African community psychology course must take this reality as its starting point. And as I conclude, universities and students in our institutions have to resemble and serve the community within which they are located. Practically, this means that the curriculum taught at our institutions of higher learning must reflect the cultural imperatives, the developmental agenda, the needs and aspirations of the community they serve, and not go into the community imposing and already assuming what it is that the community needs. The design of the psychology curriculum must be based on these socio-cultural patterns and features of the communities concerned. In this way, students of community psychology and subsequently graduates from universities will see themselves as active participants in the development and well-being of their communities. In our view, a decolonized curriculum must take this socio-ethical dimension of being a member of a community as its point of departure. Pepperson calls those who dream and work for change decolonizing dreamers. These dreamers wreck, they scavenge, they retool and reassemble the colonizing university into decolonizing contraptions. We are decolonizing dreamers, and we teach to subvert coloniality and its binaries and essentialisms. We believe that binaries do not see our connection to land, to spiritual identities, and the ever-present ancestors, and the unity of our bodies and mind. I end with an invitation to all of us to consider being decolonial dreamers as we continue to disrupt the entrenched canons in our midst. Thank you.
Thank you, Puleng, and it's wonderful to hear you sharing your dreaming with us. Great to hear this. I'm going to ask Nelson to come in at this point. Nelson?
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for all the thanks to the organizers and everyone involved in making the anthology and this event possible. I'm going to offer some reflections about decolonial psychology as a counter-catastrophic science, which is the title of my short piece in the volume. And I want to do this by going over 8 different points. The first of which is that, by and large, the basic concepts of the social and behavioral sciences reflect the need to understand a world that is driven by modern Western ideas of progress and change. Here we immediately think of the European Enlightenment and of the birth of the modern research university in the 19th century of the Common Era. 3 basic concepts of the emerging social sciences then were, in a way continue to be, subject, society, and discipline. These 3 concepts, subject, society, and disciplines, became fundamental references in the formulation of any, or at least most, sciences of the human. Psychology is one of these sciences, and we know, of course, that it has traditionally focused on the subject, the first of these concepts. And we know that psychology has a history of seeking to adapt subjects to modern society, therefore playing a fundamental conservative role. From here, that there is an anti-psychiatry movement that targets conservative psychology, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry. Second, it would suffice one to be critical of modern Western views of progress and development to also identify and be critical of conservative psychologies. That is, those conservative psychologies are the ones that ultimately seek to adjust subjects to that changing world, to a world driven by these notions of progress and development. But the critique of progress and development by itself does not counter Eurocentrism or racism. This means that there can be racist and conservative psychologists, just as there can be racist anti-psychologists and anti-psychiatry psychiatry projects. Now, I am not going to be discussing here what I take to be racist conservative psychologists and racist anti-psychologists. My point, my basic point is that phenomena like coloniality and racism require more than science, discipline, and criticism to address them. Also, that they escape the division between psychology and anti-psychology. That is that coloniality and racism escape that division and therefore need some other interventions beyond just psychology or anti-psychology. And therefore one can say between psychology and, let's say, critical psychology, all of these are varied versions of kind of a same root that still needs to be disturbed. What I take the Garth, Stevens, and Christopher's volume entitled Decoloniality, Knowledge Production, and Epistemic Justice in Contemporary Community Psychology to do is to join a search, not just for an anti or a critical psychology, but for a psychology that can actually identify, address, and counter racism and coloniality. That is, this volume is part of a search for something along the lines of a decolonial psychology. It is not strange that places with a strong colonial past and racial present, like South Africa, Australia, and the Caribbean, are major sites in the search for this kind of psychology. My contribution to the volume is entitled, this is point 4, Decolonial Psychology as Counter-Catastrophic Science, and it argues that decolonial psychologists shift the ground of psychology in fundamental ways. One of these ways is that they formulate concepts that are proper to the understanding, not of modernity simpliciter, but of modernity coloniality. This means that instead of placing the triad, subject, society, and disciplines that I mentioned before, which are at the core of the modern European, modern Western human sciences, that instead of putting that triad at the center of its conceptual framework, this decolonial psychology searches for other such fundamental concepts and is based on other such fundamental concepts. My chapters identify a different triad, not that they have to be three, and just identifying just some basic concepts that seem to be at the core of anything like a decolonial psychology. And they are modernity coloniality as catastrophe, Western modernity as a paradigm of war, and massacre, rape, and torture as ways of life. Those three are, I present them as key fundamental concepts that should arguably be part in the construction of any decolonial psychology beyond conservative psychologies and traditional critical psychologies. So I want to take then a few minutes to go over each of these concepts. Modernity, coloniality as catastrophe, that's one. Western modernity as a paradigm of war, that's two. Massacre, rape, and torture as ways of life, that's the third one. So the fifth point, focusing on this first element, modernity, coloniality, and catastrophe. By catastrophe, I mean, actually, catastrophe literally means a downturn, a massive change, if you will, of events or a narrative that renders obsolete all existing frameworks for explanation, and it demands the formulation of new approaches and concepts. Modernity coloniality is not one historical period in a progressive line that goes from primitive to the ancient and from the ancient to the modern, but it is the argument that I make in the paper, the veritable creation of a new world. This new modern colonial world, as others have also said, was built around notions of discovery and conquest. It became central at around 1492 of the Common Era in colonizations that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So, and I look at these spaces as interconnected. And therefore, that's also relevant for the kind of decolonial discourse and project that we want to formulate, recognize that interconnection. The second concept, Western modernity as a paradigm of war. This concept indicates that what we call Western modernity is less about the introduction of a certain view of progress and development in the formation of political communities and individuals, particularly the modern nation state and the modern citizen, and more about naturalizing modern colonial catastrophe and its permanent war against certain humans and groups of humans that are conceived as lesser humans or non-humans. The lines between the human and non-human have been primarily drawn by modern colonialism, modern slavery, and race. What I'm proposing here is that racial difference is manifested as an ongoing war of conquest and or extermination against subjects marked racially. So active racialization and coloniality have the form of a permanent war. And the seventh point, I mean, really now in relation to this third element of that is basic, I think, for the colonial psychology, that massacre, rape, and torture are a ways of life. And therefore, massacre, rape, and torture, they take place in this permanent war, and they are foundational in modernity. And so the point is that massacre, rape, and torture as three core activities in the permanent war of modern colonial catastrophe, right? Are three core activities in that permanent war. Following Fanon's writings, I offer a description of what Fanon calls a racist structure, quote unquote, as one where massacre, rape, and torture become a way of life. One is tempted to say that these ways of life are truly more than anything ways of death. Yet this expression also falls short of indicating the gravity of catastrophe. Massacre is not just killing, but a particular form of eliminating life. We also know that rape and torture have been preferred means of conducting colonial wars and subjugating enslaved people. In a way, rape and torture are meant to be even worse than death. They are meant to bring permanent humiliation and ongoing suffering, maintaining people alive only so that they can experience that suffering, only so that they can constantly live in that stage of terror. Now, I ask you, what kind of psychology can seek healing in such a world? And will it suffice to be a science? This leads me to the last point. And of course, in saying that while rape, torture, and massacre, and particularly rape and torture, are worse than death, that doesn't mean that subjects who survive it can actually go beyond death and beyond that stage that is worse than death. That means that surviving rape and torture is really an extraordinary achievement in modernity coloniality. Right? Since professional and academic psychology, and this is a line that I'm quoting from the essay, since professional and academic psychology are themselves part of a hegemonic order of knowledge that is entangled with coloniality, then any counter-catastrophic psychology needs to also become, in one dimension or another, a form of counter-psychology. And I want to add that a counter-psychology cannot simply be learned in a classroom or be found in the writings of articles or books. Our PhDs in philosophy or psychology do not make us experts in counter-psychology, and our conferences and panels may not put us closer to that goal either. A counter-psychology requires something more radical that involves the capacity to resign from psychology itself. Here, of course, ancestors like Frantz Fanon, who resigned from his position as director of the, who abandoned his position as a director of a psychiatric hospital to join the Algerian Revolution, indicated the path of a decolonial psychology that dares to become a counter-science and a counter-psychology, and therefore to go beyond psychology itself. And so the true leaders of a counter-psychology might be community leaders and agents of social change who have transcended disciplinary training and who have also critically rejected the limitations of superficial identity politics and formulaic rejections of colonialism and racism. Thank you.
Wow, thanks. Great, Nelson. Again, an important injunction for all of us and a striking challenge, I think, to all of us in psychology today, to think about the very origins of our discipline and the limits of the discipline itself when one thinks about the decolonial turn. So, colleagues, let me thank you all as panelists for your wonderful contributions. You know, just thinking about this, as Chris was speaking, talking about archival expansion, knowledge from the margin, critical mutual accompaniment, and so on. These are clearly not exhaustive themes that have emerged in the writings in the volume. And certainly others like Glenn Adams, Ignacio Dobles, Ronald Alison, Kopano Ratele, Shanaz Safla, Gita Reddy, Jessica Fernandez, etc., have all done similar kinds of work that, of course, have tried to lift and surface some of the key elements that are emerging in the work around decoloniality today. When I was listening to Urmi's paper, I was thinking about the relationship between coloniality and alterity. And of course, it struck me that there are so many similarities with the damne, or the wretched of the earth, as Fanon would have characterized the marginalized across the globe today. And again, the importance of listening to alternative stories, accounts, and narratives, and histories that can in fact democratize and expand our notion of histories with a small h as opposed to history with a capital H. And it does seem to me that this is a central feature of epistemic justice if one is thinking about new theory, new knowledge, and of course, the very practice of decoloniality. I was also thinking about this for colleagues in South Africa, the recent protests in parts of Gauteng and the parts of KwaZulu-Natal, and the kind of re-racialization that we saw in areas like Phoenix. One of the ways in which South Africans have responded to this, of course, is with a fairly flippant response that this was simply looting. But there is an injunction again for us to understand and to listen to the alternative stories, accounts, and narratives of those who operate on the margins, who find themselves on the fringes, who are the precariat in any society. And I think, again, Urmi, your work speaks eloquently to that. Alison, the work that you're doing on arts and arts-based practice in some ways, when you were talking about the fetishization of the other and the affective dimensions of maintaining white supremacy, again, I think that this is a thread that one sees across the world in areas where white supremacy continues to reign. And again, I think what you were talking to was really the importance of stories from below, or the kind of social histories from below. And arts as a different kind of symbolic representation and expression that is beyond text as we traditionally know text through either the written or the spoken word, but through the kind of viscerality, the aesthetics, and the embodiments of the arts that I think that Kenneth Gergen at some point referred to as performative social science. Puleng, again, just thinking about the work on canons and canonical thought and how we disrupt this in our institutions so that we do not have a static approach to knowledge, but rather a dynamic and potentially ever-changing and expanding knowledge archive is really, really critical. And of course, you raise important issues around culture and context in the theorization of new knowledge, the importance of a non-universal approach to knowledge, and retraining us all in ways as we approach knowledge production and understandings of the human condition beyond that which we've been accustomed to in the kind of modernist project today. I think the idea of expanding the archive, but not jettisoning one archive for another, is also important because, of course, this is not the way that knowledge moves over historical time. But I think the important thing that you're raising again is the internal critique of psychology and the importance of us being ever vigilant, not only to think about psychology's utility, but also its limitations and the ever-present need for us to be internally critical of psychology as a discipline. And then, of course, Nelson, really pushing us to think about psychology and psychology's, in some way, its complicity in the creation of the subject of modernity, who's been adaptable to the modernist context, and really making the argument that disturbing science itself is important, as science will not be enough to disturb coloniality. In some ways, the search for a new psychology has to be a search to address catastrophe, war, massacre, and the very nature of the human, and the idea of the human, which has been crafted through Western modernist thought, needs to be tackled in any kind of counter-psychology project today. Certainly the idea that the counter-psychology has to be based on the possibility of leaving behind psychology or abandoning psychology, a rupture of sorts may be required, I think is a really, really critical point. And one that's been raised before, by a number of texts and a number of writers of text in psychology itself. But this kind of question about how it is that we hold on to our disciplinary homes to give us a sense of stability, and to give us a sense of understanding of the world, and the fact that this may require a rupture with that, I think is a critical element that you've really pointed to today. So thank you to all of you for your wonderful comments. We're going to open it to a Q&A at this point. And just maybe as a start, I see that Puleng, there's a question for you at this time. But before that, let me just check with any of the panelists if there's anything that they're wanting to come back on at this point, just having listened to each other's talks right now. Anything from any of the panelists? None? Okay, so maybe we can go straight into the Q&A. I mean, Puleng, there's a question for you in particular, and it's really whether the concept of Ubuntu is the same thing as the concept of the human being, and if so, you know, why would you say that it is so? And if not, what are the specific differences between the concepts in your particular view? Do you want to come back on that one at this point?
Yes, Garth. I can come back on that. And for me, I think here, again, is the point where language really fails me, in a sense that the whole idea of umuntu or mutu, or the idea of botu, is not, as the question says, my answer is it's not an equivalent, because when you look at the concept of botu, it looks at a human being as something that is not fixed, as something that is not static, but instead it looks at botu as a process of constant becoming, right? Where a person's humanity is always in relation to other human beings, and our relationship to other human beings. So it is possible, therefore, that you can have a human being who does not have a botu or Ubuntu, and in that way, therefore, their humanity can be questioned in many ways. So it's something, Ubuntu is rooted within culture, where a person is embedded, where the interests of the community comes before those of the individual. So again, that idea of the communality of us as human beings becomes important and becomes centered, where members feel connected to others, and where we see each other in relation to other people, where not other people are seen as inferior and others are seen as superior. So I think it's all encompassing, and it really goes much broader than the limited way in which the idea of human being is looked at. So it's much broader than that when you look at the idea of personhood as a process of becoming, and not you become a human being. The implication is that not all individuals, even though we both look like people, are indeed people, as some African philosophers have said. So that would be my response to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Puleng. Thanks. I see that there are a number of hands coming up in the attendees list as well. Can I ask attendees to please put their questions in the Q&A box so that we can take those questions? While we're doing that, I mean, I wanted to just check with the panelists, actually. And really, I mean, I think that it's a striking challenge. Nelson, you've given us a striking challenge. I mean, you've referenced, of course, people in the anti-psychiatry movement. You've referenced Sonn when Sonn resigns his position, and the idea of rupturing with a disciplinary home in some ways is, I think, something that would be a challenge to most psychologists. And I wondered what the panelists thought, because in fact, I think Nelson may be the only panelist who sits outside of psychology in some ways, but all of the other panelists are sitting inside psychology. And I wondered what the other panelists' thoughts were about the idea of the potential to rupture from a discipline that we've all been fairly well inducted into. So we've approached the critique of psychology in two fundamental ways. The one is that we've approached the critique of psychology as internal to psychology, and then we've approached the critique to psychology as looking for the social relevance or the utility of psychology to manage the kind of social challenges and the problems of the human condition today. But I wondered what you thought about Nelson's challenged to think through the possibility of actually the abandonment of a discipline like psychology if one wants to attend to the question of decoloniality in its totality. So I'm going to open it to the panelists at this point while we're also waiting for some of the Q&As. And don't be shy. You can all jump in immediately. Urmi, you want to come in?
Thank you, Garth, and for that question. And I think it's also really important to recognize that we may be differently positioned in relation to psychology. And I'm speaking about this from my position as someone who is now in the US in the global north, but in many ways at the fringes of the discipline of psychology. A lot of the work that I do is, is not legible to most psychologists around me. So I think there are sort of, depending on what your relationship is to these hegemonic knowledge constructions, that also shapes, who you are and what you do. But I think the point that I really want to raise is that there is something problematic about focusing on the discipline when we are talking about decoloniality, because disciplinarity is antithetical to decoloniality, and also as as many have talked about, as Nelson has highlighted, that psychology is itself a colonial project. So beginning with the discipline and what its relevance can be, that already skews the question of what it is that we're looking at and what our priorities are. So I think rather than asking about that, we really have to decenter the discipline. So so we cannot begin begin this work with the question of what is the psychology and what it can do, but we have to begin with what is really our responsibility and the kind of duties that we have in the spaces that we occupy, that we try and transgress, to speak to what is happening in the world right now, and to really respond to that. And it's not only producing knowledge, and I think that is the other issue, that we get so caught up, because of being in academia, occupying academic spaces, in the production of knowledge, that we don't focus on the ways of relating and the ways of being that have to be transformed in order for us to to move towards decolonial futures. So those are just some thoughts that I had, and I think another question that I also want to put out there is, what does it even, as we are talking about epistemic justice and as we are talking about transforming knowledge, to really ask the question as to whether we are really transforming the terms of the dialogue that we have, or are there ways in which the global north and whiteness still impinges on how we talk, on how we are expected to present, how we are expected to write. All of those questions, I think, are also really significant for us to have, and to really, and these are necessary so that decolonial does not become an empty signifier, as Garth talked about in the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Urmi. Anybody else wanting to come in here at this point? Chris, did you want to come in?
Yeah, Garth, I can come in. I think thank you for those comments, Urmi, and thank you for your summary, Garth. This is look, I sort of, I agree with Urmi around the fact that there's multiple psychologies, I think, and even though psychology has its roots in coloniality, modernity, some of the sorts of ways in which people have written in the book is that perhaps part of the starting point, and I think, and especially the New Zealand crew, and what I gained from it is the ethical imperative that drives how we respond, because part of the challenge that we often have in psychology is that we always either driven by a question or by a theory or by a method, and what they are arguing for, I think, is that perhaps there's a different starting point, and that is, as Urmi maybe have suggested, that is in the relationship, and it is in our responsibility or the call of an other or the other. The other sort of challenge or issue that I always see is that we often criticize psychology as if it is one singular sort of discipline, homogeneous discipline. And I always wondered too about, and that in itself, I guess, is there's a hegemonic psychology, and there's the peripheral psychologies that Urmi talks about, and what the possibilities might be for the for plural, and what it means for us to be thinking about psychology, even when we think about psychology or community psychology. What happens to psychology when we think about community, and what are some of the root metaphors that governs how we do that thinking? I think what Puleng introduces asks or locates and asks for a rethinking of the type of psychology that can be put to service in the South African or the African context. When I think about the projects in Australia, for example, on indigenous and indigenizing psychology, some of that process is still hooked on to psychology or particular metaphors, particular understandings of psychology and its core subject. Others transform psychology completely. So I think part of what's possible, and if we go with the idea of expanding ecologies of knowledge, that within the archive, it is going to be about retrieving and understanding psychologies that have been left out or that have been made invisible, and perhaps reimagining the sorts of the epistemologies and the sorts of basic assumptions, as Garth have also pointed out, about our relationships with human and non-human. And that requires, I don't know if it's the abandoning of psychology, or if it is the reimagining of it. So that's sort of dreaming.
Thanks, Chris. Puleng, Alison, any of you wanting to come in at this point?
Yes, Garth, and thank you. I think one of the things that has really been a challenge, and not only in psychology, but I think in various other disciplines as well, is this idea that Lewis Gordon calls, disciplinary decadence. And I think many of us are so married to the discipline that it becomes a challenge, and it becomes difficult for people to let go of that which they are so used to, and that which has come to define how they do things as well. But I think starting by acknowledging the challenge within psychology, and that psychology indeed was part of the colonial project, is important for us. And I think if we start looking beyond the discipline and looking at other disciplines and looking at the work that needs to be done. So if we're thinking about work that pushes us towards social justice, if we think about work that centers our humanity, work that looks at responding to the social ills, then that will allow us to not be confined to our disciplines. And one of the challenges is this idea, some of my students, after they've written a proposal and it's gone through the review process, and some of them would come back and say, the question that the reviewers are asking is, where is the psychology in this, right? And I think if we're still restricted by that, it's going to also make it difficult for us to start thinking outside the limited spaces of what defines a psychology. And I think doing that will assist us to moving towards a decolonial possibility, and based on our context where we are, in our context, centering African perspectives and cosmologies in how we engage with the challenges in our society, in how we engage with issues that are confronting us and how we can respond to those. And for some of us in many of our attempts, we found that psychology has not been useful in that endeavor. And that is why the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary perspective becomes very important, because then you're not limited to a singular or a binary view to issues and challenges in the world.
Great, thanks, Puleng. Alison, are you wanting to come in?
No, I'm all right.
Okay, thanks. So I see a number of questions in the chat here, and Nelson, I'm going to give you an opportunity if you wanted to come back on that matter a little later on as well. But I see a number of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to summarize from Nazipo and from Catherine. In both instances, I think the questions are related to how one thinks about Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism and so on, and whether this, to what extent this is possible, to what extent this can also be essentializing. And I suppose this is not only related to Afrocentricity, but in many kinds of ways where we study perspectives of indigenous groups, etc. And the question here is, to what extent can this be essentializing, and how is it that it becomes possible to escape the kind of gaze of Western modernity when one is thinking about new epistemes and so on. And again, I'm going to open that up to the panel.
Hi, Garth. I always find this question very interesting, that when we speak about the importance of centering African ways of knowing and quick, and it's not the first time, and there is a quick response to say, but are we not essentializing? Are we not saying that other forms of knowing or psychologies are not good? And I think it's important to understand, as I was saying, or I've been saying, that what's important is that we need to start from the base. We need to start from where we are. And for us who are in Africa, where we can start, we can only start from our African base. We can only start from where we are and from what we know. And that means our African perspective, our African worldview, our African cosmologies, which involves our spirituality, our rituals, and everything that defines who we are. And as you correctly point out, if you go to other places as well, when we're talking about indigenization, you go to Australia, you go to Aotearoa, you go to many places in South America as well. The idea there is that we need to center our way of knowing, because it will assist us to be able to respond to the challenges and issues that we have, that we are confronted with. That's where we start, right? So it's about centering and not necessarily throwing everything away, but everything else should be outside and be or drawn from, to assist us to be able to learn from one another. So when you're talking about the idea of globalization or global, so that we start from the local before we move to the global. When I started my talk, I spoke about what Moscovici said and what Ramon Grossvogel reminds us about the psychologies that we're practicing, about how Western modernity has inferiorized other ways of being in the world, and how that has in turn led to the marginalization and invisibilization of other ways of knowing. So me saying, let's center Afrocentric ways of being and doing and knowing does not automatically negate other ways of knowing. And hence we speak about the importance of pluriversality and having plurivocal and pluri-perspectives to the world, because that can assist us to be able to respond to our challenges where we are first and foremost. Thanks.
Thanks, Puleng. I think you've clarified the point about recentering and not necessarily talking about the kind of jettisoning of one knowledge archive for another. So thanks for that. Alison, I see that there's a question coming up on the Q&A also, really talking about, whether you could share some of your experiences of what it was like being, a white psychologist working in a Black community, and what were some of the kind of challenges, or what were some of the learnings that you had in that process itself?
Yes. Well, I guess I'd probably just start by saying that I'm not considered, interestingly, I'm not considered a psychologist in Australia. So I entered these spaces more as a researcher from the university, which I suppose carries some different perceptions as well. I guess an important thing to say too is that the group was working within a context of a council, which has a lot of white social workers and other white sort of personnel working with different groups. But I think probably one of the things that I would say is approaching it as I would be initially just as a researcher, was to try to sort of stand on the sidelines and, not take up space as a white person coming in and draw attention to myself and just listen and witness. But I remember like a very distinct conversation we were having when the council was trying to censor the young women's poem, and it started a really heated discussion. And one of the young women turned to me and was like, well, what about you? Do you have our backs? Because there are only 2 white people in the room. And sort of, I guess at that moment, it really made me think about, what are the different ways that, well, I suppose first, you can't be silent, you can't be quiet, and you can't be apolitical in doing this type of work. So in trying to be silent and open up space, I think I probably, had to consider the ways in which that was also being complicit or passive. And so it really kind of pushed me to take a different role. And I think probably one of the most important things is that in some ways, the longer that we worked together and got to know each other and always showed up for each other in different ways, including them for me, is probably the most important thing. So I suppose relationality and the ethics of relationality and making our values and our ethics sort of known in the forefront, I think has been something that over time we've been able to then navigate different situations where we're both put into, we're all put into really sort of strange racialized boxes that we have to work through together. And I guess the other thing is like having a lot of fun was really important to the work that we're doing, because I think otherwise it wears people down, it burns you out. If you don't continually go to the space each week, enjoying yourself and loving what you're doing, and also that the lines of work and relationships are not definitive ones. So sometimes getting calls in the middle of the night to support each other and that sort of thing. So I think that's what I would probably say, is that it really blurs boundaries.
Thanks, Alison. I mean, it reminds me of some of the work that's been going on in South Africa around whiteness, blackness, and who has the authority to speak. What one of my colleagues, Gillian Eagle, speaks about warrants. Who has the warrant to really articulate something at a particular point in time? And so, of course, there's a debate about, when one stands on the margins or one is in the center, does it give you a warrant to speak on behalf of those on the margins if you stand at the center. And I think it's an important kind of debate that's probably going to continue, not only in your neck of the woods, but certainly in South Africa as well. I wanted to just check if, Nelson, did you want to come back at any point here?
Hi, Garth. Well, no, I am following the conversation, of course. I thank my colleagues for all their contributions and for this last round of reflections. I guess I should say that in a nutshell, perhaps what I was trying to propose in relation to the discipline is that if you take these three elements, among others, modernity, coloniality as catastrophe, Western modernity as permanent war, and massacre, rape, and torture as ways of life, that those three rubrics, concepts can serve as references, fundamental references for decolonial psychologies, however that is understood. But also that properly understood, these concepts take you beyond psychology and any given discipline also, in the sense that decoloniality is always beyond the scope of disciplines. And so being a decolonial agent needs to also, requires a subjectivity that is always, it can be located in different places or sites, institutions, disciplines, and using them in different ways, but it's always beyond them, right? It's always beyond them. And it recognizes that the core of decolonial thinking and theorizing have typically be outside these dominant institutions, sometimes in the borders or through different intersections, but that is never solely within that environment of the university. And so, of course, that leads to the challenge, or that links with the challenge of decolonizing the university completely. So when we talk about decolonial psychologists, it's never only about psychology. Ultimately, when you talk about decolonization of any given field, you will always touch on the larger aspect of decolonizing the university and decolonizing our entire, society and the web of power relations in which we are all live in. I also should say that I must apologize. I do have another commitment at 9, but I can stay 10 minutes after for the sake. But if you see me disappearing, it's not out of respect for the space. It's only that I had this other event at 9, but I can stay a few minutes more. Thank you so much for letting me a moment to share my views. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nelson. I'm very mindful of time as well, so I'm just going to ask the other panelists if they've got any final reflections. We're coming up to 3 o'clock. Let me just go through each of them quickly. Urmi, any last reflections from you?
Thank you, Garth. I just wanted to make one quick note. I think with all of these conversations that we've been having, we talk a lot about local, we talk about global. I think we need to move past that kind of a binary, given that we know how they get configured. And instead, the focus on local is not isolated. So I would just leave with the thought that I think local is a form of engagement, a form of working from a rooted place. And the kinds of dialogues that we have, such as in spaces like this, are ways of connecting with each other from places that are also rooted. So that's just the thought that I had in response to some of what we've been talking about.
Thanks, Urmi. Puleng?
Thank you very much, Garth, and thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everybody. I've been looking at some of the questions and comments, and I think opening up spaces such as these for such conversations and reflections are very necessary. As we continue to really think about a psychology or psychologies that can assist us to be able to make sense of the world, to be able to respond and speak back and do the kind of work that can contribute towards a better world, towards social justice. I think it's important to always create such spaces. I think the conversation today, which really focused on many contexts, shows the need for such conversations, but also the need for solidarities and engagements across different contexts as we continue to move towards a decolonial psychology, a decolonial form of education more broadly, and in a world where all humanity is acknowledged, respected, and really embraced. So thank you very much. Those are my concluding thoughts.
Thanks very much, Puleng. Chris, any last thoughts from your side?
Yeah, sure, Garth. Look, I also want to just thank everyone for their contributions to this webinar, and also to the book. Really, Puleng, I really love the way in which you talked about being decolonial dreamers. I think fundamentally, psychology is a very powerful discipline. I think that there's the need to maybe, I think the provocations that Nelson has offered about transcending it, because the sorts of challenges that we have, I think, is beyond the discipline. The need for interdisciplinarity, the need for us to be able to understand the complex web of power relationships and the sorts of structures that continues to shape lives and so forth. So psychology has to open its boundaries, and it has to have conversations with other disciplines. I think, Puleng, the justice, the idea of justice, equity, of inclusion, I think pluriversality, but also I think my colleague Matthew Klugman, I'm not too sure if he's still here, says we can't say love. And I think the notions of decolonial love and decoloniality as a project of love and as a project of justice, I think, is an extremely important one for us to pursue, because that is about interculturality, the expansion of boundaries and inclusion. And I think the countering of the sorts of micro and everyday sorts of violences that Urmi talks about, and lots of other people talk about. So these conversations and the possibilities and opportunities for us to be able to come together, to share the ways in which we actually do this is really important. And I hope that we can continue to do so now that we have access to these wonderful technologies. Thank you. Thanks, Garth.
Thanks, Chris. Alison, any last thoughts from you?
No, I just want to say thank you for opening up the space and having us all here. I've really learned a lot and appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Alison. So colleagues, I see that we're just on 3 o'clock. I want to extend my thanks, first of all, to all of the panelists. I know that it's late in the evening in some places and early in the morning in others. Really just to extend my thanks to Chris, to Urmi, to Alison, to Puleng, to Nelson. Really wonderful talks, very provocative, and certainly something that I think we're going to take forward in future webinars and future conversations. Thank you to all of the participants today for your questions. I know that we were not able to get to all of your questions, and I'm sure that we're going to have an opportunity, but I encourage you to engage us all. We're all available at some place or another, either on email or on one of these social media platforms. So please do keep the conversation going. To the colleagues in the PsySSA office who have really pulled this all together on the back end, really appreciate all the work that's been done there. And to the hosts, the Psychological Society of South Africa and the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences, thank you very much for hosting us today, for pulling this together, and we look forward to further engagements of this nature. With that, everybody, I think we're going to close for today. Again, thank you to all of you, and look forward to the next webinar. Please do check the chats for information, and please do also fill out your register so that you can access your CPD points. I'm going to ask the panelists if they can just stay behind for 1 minute as we close off. And again, thank you to everybody. Bye-bye.